Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jonathan Silver. I'm the Director for Academic Programs at the Tikva Fund. I'm very pleased to welcome you this evening to the Tikva Center. Our guest tonight really needs very little introduction. Rabbi Dr. Daniel Gordis is the Senior Vice President and Correct Distinguished Fellow at Shalom College, a regular columnist for the Jerusalem Post, a frequent contributor to the New York Times, print and online editions. He's written really too many books to name, but tonight we're here to celebrate the publication of this new book, Menachem Begin, The Battle for Israel's Soul. It was released this very day by Next Book in partnership with Random House. It's something that Tikva Fund is very proud of, and I hope that you'll find interesting. It just occurred to me, if you walk through Barnes & Noble, look on Amazon, you'll see oodles, countless books about the American founding and the American founding fathers. These are distinguished statesmen. They're studied as founders, but it's almost impossible to study the founders of the state of Israel, really the heroic rebirth of the ancient civilization, the heroic story of our age. It's impossible to study them as founders in the same way. And at the Tikva Fund, we hope that this book, this study of Menachem Begin, helps to rehabilitate the study of the founders of the modern state of Israel, to engage in that discussion and to help us begin such an endeavor. There's no one better to help us than Rabbi Dr. Danny Gordis.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon and evening. It's really a great honor to have been asked to share with you some thoughts about the Begin book, specifically on the date, coincidentally, that it happens to appear. Menachem Begin, as you know, was born in 1913. So, since Begin is born in 1913, we're essentially in his centenary year. And that was why the book was kind of done right now, to try to get it out as close as we could to his 100th birthday. And because we're at the Tikva Fund and we're at the Tikva Center, I thought it would be appropriate to try to say something this afternoon about Begin that kind of evokes the traditions and the commitments to which the Tikva Fund is dedicated. Therefore, I want to try to think about Begin in biblical terms this evening. I want to try to say something about him doing his life's work on a biblical tapestry and say to you something about why I think that actually mattered to him. When I wrote the book, I had a title. I'm actually very bad at titles, among many other things. I'm also bad at titles, but I had a great title for the book. And the title for the book was Menachem Begin, Israel's Jewish Prime Minister. Now, a little edgy, I grant you, but I actually think it's true. He was definitely Israel's most Jewish Prime Minister, but I think it's actually even fair to say that he was Israel's Jewish Prime Minister. Apparently a little bit too edgy for the people at Random House, and it got nixed, so we called it The Battle for Israel's Soul. But I want to actually speak this evening about the book as if that were the title. As if the title were Menachem Begin, Israel's Jewish Prime Minister. And to suggest to you that what animated Begin was his basic biblical conception of the world. I'm going to give you a brief overview. I'm sure it's not necessary for the vast majority of people here, but just in case, a very brief overview of his life and how it unfolded. But then I want to try to at least put his life's major accomplishments into the context of a kind of a biblical take on the world, a biblical take on Judaism, a biblical take on the Jewish people. So a very brief rendition of his life's work. Born in 1913, as I said, in Brisk-Litovsk. If you were curious as to who the midwife was, which I'm sure you are, it was Ariel Sharon's grandmother. So they would end their lives together, their families began their lives together. Begin's father and Sharon's grandfather were very good friends. They were actually partners in crime. They broke into the Soloveitchik Shul in Brisk-Litovsk to have a memorial service for Theodore Herzl over against the objections of Rabbi Soloveitchik of that time. The Soloveitchik tradition has changed in that regard. But in any event, so the Shinerman, eventually Sharon, but Shinerman and Begin families go way back. He's born in 1913, grows up, really comes of age, as his sister put it, between the wars, obviously. Very early on, his father puts them in HaShomer HaTzair, decides very quickly that HaShomer HaTzair is more interested in socialists, wherever they be, than in Jews anywhere, and yanks them out and puts them in Beitar, which was the youth movement of basically Vladimir Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionism. Begin very quickly finds his place. He was a kind of a little bit of a socially awkward kid, a little bit thin. One of his friends who wrote a little memoir that I used for the book talked about how he was on a train somewhere in Poland, sitting next to the prettiest girl from Brisk-Litovsk, and all he did all afternoon was talk to her about Jabotinsky. I think if you were writing her book, that would be where her biography is when she wanted to jump out of the window of the train, but he was kind of clueless about a lot of things.
I would have jumped into his arms.
Jabotinsky, the revision Zionism, became eventually the head of Beitar in Poland, as I'm sure all of you are aware. Eventually had a basically a falling out with Jabotinsky, was much more hardline about certain things than Jabotinsky was, became actually Jabotinsky's great distress, shall we say, a much better orator than was Jabotinsky himself, which was quite an accomplishment since Jabotinsky himself was a great orator, and is sent on a number of trips by Jabotinsky apparently just to get him away from the center of the action. On one of these trips he spends a meal at the home of a family, meets their young daughter, writes her a letter 3 days later and says, my dear lady, I only met you 3 days ago, but I feel as if I've known you all my life. That, of course, was Eliza, who would accompany him the rest of his days. They were married relatively quickly thereafter. The Nazis invade Poland, and Begin and Eliza flee. They flee Poland and go to Russia, long before the vast majority of Beitar members have managed to get out of Poland. And it was an accusation that the captain had left the ship too early that would dog him the rest of his life. And the tremendous sense of shame that he felt in having left Poland early would actually color some of the very important actions that he was later to take, including, for example, refusing to get off the Altalena, even as it was burning and exploding. The young guys on the ship had to literally take him off the boat physically and put him in a little boat and take him towards shore. He refused to leave because he'd been accused of leaving months before. And if the metaphor then had been the captain of the ship, now he wasn't quite the captain of the ship, but he was metaphorically the captain of the ship. And it affected a lot of other things as well. He is arrested relatively quickly in Russia, as I'm sure all of you know, by the NKVD, sort of a precursor of the KGB. He is charged of a crime of which he's actually guilty. He's charged with being a Zionist, which he refused to deny. He refused to deny that he refused to plead guilty because he said, it's just not a crime. I am a Zionist, but it's not a crime. He was arrested. Now, we all know, of course, that he became the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, so it's obvious that he got out of Soviet prison. But it's important for us, if we're to fully appreciate the complexity of his life, and in fact, part of the miraculous nature of his life, to remember that the vast majority of people who got sucked into the Soviet penal system at that point were never heard of again. There was every reason to assume that was the end. He understood that. In fact, while he was in prison, he actually tried to write a get for Eliza so that she would be able to remarry if he was never heard from again. A friend of his convinced him not to do it. It was actually Masha Leon's father. Some of you know Masha Leon, who writes for The Forward. It was her father who was in prison with Begin, who convinced him not to give Eliza the get. He said, you're going to get out of here. But there was really no reason to expect that. By the way, the same token, she had no reason to expect that she was going to see him. And in one interesting anecdote, she smuggled in a handkerchief to him with an embroidered 3 letters on it. Why he needed a handkerchief in Soviet prison, he was not entirely sure. Sooner there was some significance to the initials on the handkerchief, which were OLA. Now we're with a sophisticated audience. Why did it say OLA? Whose initials were they? Ola, the verb. Ani Ola, I'm going to Palestine. I.e., if and when you get out, don't look for me here. I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be there. He did get out. It's a whole long, complicated story, which the book goes into, about how he was drafted into the Polish Free Army. The Polish Free Army marched their troops over to Transjordan, then into Palestine. He gets to Palestine in 1942 at the age of 29. 29 is also, incidentally, the exact number of years that he would spend in the political opposition. Now, when he first got to Palestine, he was still in the Polish Free Army. He was not able to do much of anything. He was still a soldier, and he took that oath very seriously. But Yechiel Kadishai, who is his lifelong partner and in politics, his right-hand man, who passed away, as you know, 2 or 3 months ago, after an extraordinary life in his own right. Yechiel Kadishai, I interviewed for the book about a year ago, less than a year ago. A few months before the book went to the press, I interviewed for the last time. And in our conversation as it was winding down, I said to him, you know, of all the things you've spoken about Begin in print, and I've watched all the interviews and so forth, I actually don't recall how you met him. So he smiled and he said, well, here's the story. The first time I met him, I didn't really meet him. He said it was in 1942. I, Kadishai, was stationed in Ismailia, because most of the young Jewish men had joined the British Army. The British Army stationed us near Ismailia. I was guarding a warehouse. It was completely boring work. And I got a 3-day furlough. What does a Jewish boy in Ismailia do during a 3-day furlough? You go back home. You take a bus to Tel Aviv, which was a young city at that point, and went home to see my friends. So when I got home to Tel Aviv, there was a rumor circulating that had actually been circulating for a while, but nobody took it seriously because it was so patently, obviously ridiculous. But now the rumor was circulating again, and now it was clear that it might actually be true. And the rumor was that Hitler was going to try to wipe out Polish Jewry. He said, like, unthinkable. 4 million Polish Jews? You can't wipe out 4 million people. Well, of course, we all know that you could. And this rumor was circulating around Tel Aviv when Hadi Shai came back for his furlough. And there was a meeting in the building that is now Mitzudat Ze'ev, the Likud Party headquarters, which was then just a small little half-height building, sort of half dug into the sand on the Tel Aviv beach. And Hadi Shai, laughing at himself, said, we all got together, we were talking about what could we possibly do to save Polish Jewry. There's a dozen or 2 dozen young 19 and 20-year-old Jewish kids in 1942 in Palestine. What can we do to save Polish Jewry? Well, the answer, of course, is nothing at all. They had crazy ideas, by the way, parachuting people in, which, of course, Hannah Senich came out of that story. But he said in the middle of this conversation, a young guy gets up, he said, wearing John Lennon glasses. I thought that was pretty cool for a 90-year-old guy to tell me he was wearing John Lennon glasses. Somewhat anachronistic, since John Lennon had not yet made his mark. But nonetheless, and he said he was wearing the shorts and short-sleeve shirt of the Polish army, and everybody's talking, and then this guy gets up. And he says, if you want to know what to do to save Polish Jewry, start attacking the British in Palestine. That's the only thing you can do for Polish Jews. Because Polish Jews are still alive. And they're not fleeing because they have nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go in Europe. The shores of America and Canada are sealed. I mean, there are people getting out, to Australia, a few in South America, but by and large, there's nowhere to go. And the shores of Palestine, are obviously infinitely closer, are entirely sealed as well. But if the British would open up the shores of Palestine, word would get to Polish Jews. If you can get out, there's a place to go. And said this young guy in the Polish army uniform, and he hasn't even gotten to Hungary yet. Certainly Hungarian Jews can get out. You just have to hit the British hard enough that they let the Jews into Palestine. So stop talking about parachuting people in. Stop talking about all this craziness. When you are serious about helping the Jews of Europe, you will start attacking the British in Palestine. And he sat down. And Hadi Shai said to his friend on the way out, who was that? And the guy said, oh, he just got out of Soviet prison. He used to be the head of Beitar in Poland. The name is Begin. And so when Begin became the head of the Irgun a few months later, after David Raziel was killed in an action in Syria, and he was very quickly pretty much asked to assume the leadership, he knew exactly what he was going to do. This was not a plan that he came up with after he assumed the leadership of the Irgun. He knew what he was going to do before he assumed the leadership of the Irgun. And he began to do it right away. He wrote the book called The Revolt about this whole period. We're not going to go into details tonight. The British quickly named him terrorist number one. It was 10,000 sterling pounds on his head at that time, which was a lot of money back then. He goes into hiding. He has several aliases, the most famous of which is Rabbi Sassover. He knows enough Torah to give over some shiurim here and there as Rabbi Sassover. Benny is already born. Chassia is born while he's in hiding. And he lives for several years, basically, almost until the end of the British presence in Palestine, moving around a little bit here and there, most of the time as Rabbi Sassover. The British leave. They announced that they're leaving several months after the bombing of the King David Hotel, the whole complicated operation, which we're not going to go into tonight. They leave, of course, the vote on November 29th, 1947. The state is declared. Begin is not present, as you have watched these videos of Ben-Gurion reading out the Declaration of Independence. Begin is not present. He was not invited. The animosity between the Mapai and first the Irgun, and then Begin's parties, first it was Beirut, then it became Gachal, then it became Likud, and so on and so forth. The animosity between Begin and Ben-Gurion is legendary and true. There's almost no way to exaggerate it. But anyway, so Begin was, of course, not invited to the signing and quickly joins the opposition. He is says Anita Shapira, perhaps the preeminent Israeli historian alive today, along with Benny Morris and a few other extraordinary historians, says Anita Shapira that Begin is the only person who was the head of state of any country anywhere in the galaxy to have been elected on his 8th try. But for 29 years, he languishes in basically the political desert, though he does a tremendous amount, and actually joins the unity government before 1967. He's very involved in fighting reparations, which we'll come back to tonight a little bit later, which he thought was a violation of every Jewish value that he could possibly imagine, and so on and so forth. But he stays in the political opposition for a very long time until in 1977, in what's now commonly called the Mahapach, the overthrow or the surprise or the whatever. He finally assumes the position as prime minister. Then, of course, the next major thing is peace with Egypt and Sadat, Carter, Camp David, that whole thing, the Nobel Prize. Then the next major event, of course, is the attack on Iraq. Then, unfortunately, the beginning of the war in Lebanon. He's by this point already prime minister in his second term. And then Eliza dies, and he begins to fail physically, emotionally, politically, resigns, and spends the last 10 years of his life basically in seclusion. Comes out for two purposes only. Memorial services at the gravesite of Eliza, and not even all of those, and doctor's visits. And other than that, he does not leave his apartment basically for a decade. Something very poignant about the fact that the man who began his life in Palestine hiding from the British ended his life in Israel hiding from the Israelis. Hiding, mourning, it's very complicated. We're not going to go into that in great detail. But he dies in 1992 and is buried on Mount of Olives, right next to two fighters from the Lachim. They're going Feinstein and Barazani, born with a little wife. Israel's sixth prime minister, I think one of Israel's great prime ministers, and without any question, Israel's most Jewish prime minister. Now I'd like to take some time to explain to what I mean by Israel's most Jewish prime minister. Yehuda Avner, who I think has done a great service in writing the record about Menachem Begin, told me a story, actually, in the living room of my house, meeting with my research assistants, that was really extraordinary. It was in June 1981. It's always easy for me to remember when the attack on Iraq happened because I was on my honeymoon. I tell my wife I can always remember when I got married because I remember when the attack on Iraq happened. But in any event, in Yehuda, it was Erev Shavuot, right before Shavuot, and Avner gets a call from Kadishai, actually, come over to the Prime Minister's office now. He lived down the street in Rehavia. He basically ran over. And in the office are Begin, a general named Froika, and Kadishai. And Begin is completely distracted and said, Froika will explain. Froika tells him there's 8 planes on a landing strip in the Sinai Desert. They are in a matter of minutes going to take off to destroy the reactor in Iraq. You, Avner, write 3 press releases. One for complete success, one for partial success, and one for complete failure. Anyway, why do I tell you this story now? Because Avner, as he was describing the story to me, told me that on Begin's desk was a pile of loose leaf binders. That the Mossad had said, read this. Because it was all about Saddam and trying to predict what's he going to do in response. And Begin didn't touch the binders. Said Avner, he walked back and forth across the office, which was interrupted only by 4 calls. 1, they're taking off. 2, they're over the target. 3, target completely destroyed. 4, they're home safe.
Yes.
Over several hours, obviously. And what did Begin do the entire time? He paced back and forth in his office and recited Tehillim. Now, it's the only prime minister who knew enough Tehillim to recite them that long. You know, it's a lot longer flight to Iran. So if Bibi has any intention of reciting a flight to Iran, he'd better start learning some Tanakh very, very, very quickly. But of course, that's not going to be his response. This was Begin. Begin was born and bred on Tanakh. He told a story about that there was a competition in his family's home. His father apparently knew the whole Tanakh by heart, or so he said. And the kids would try to stump the father. They would begin a verse, and the father would have to complete it. And he said it was very rare that the father couldn't complete it. Just a couple of other incidences to give you a sense of how deeply ingrained Tanakh was. I want to make the argument tonight that he lived his life and plotted his life on a biblical map. He thought about himself as a member of the people, the story of which was told by the Tanakh. He couldn't imagine himself not in a story, the first part of which was the Tanakh. But he won in 1977. There was nobody more surprised than him, actually. He was really getting ready to give up the political ghost. He was getting older. He was already having some health problems. It was time. Oh my God, he won. And he walks out of the building, and Israeli journalists, being what they are, stick a microphone in his face and say to him, "You have anything to say to anybody?" And he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a kippah. Now that's very important, because it's a kind of religiosity, more on which in a little while, that is not typical Israeli religiosity. Typical Israeli religiosity is either you're wearing it or you don't have it. He walked around with a kippah all the time. He wasn't observant in the classical sense of today, but he was deeply religious. And he looked at the camera, takes the kippah out of his pocket, puts it on his head, and he says, "I want to say something to Aliza," who's standing there sheepishly beside him. And he says, "Zacharti lach chesed le'urayich, ahavat le'lotayich, lechtech acharai b'midbar, be'eretz zurat mokshim."
Oh.
A paraphrase or a butchering of the verse from Jeremiah 2:2, which is Be'eretz lo zruah. I remember, the loyalty of you in your youth and so on and so forth. When through your love you followed me, says Jeremiah, into a land unsown, and said Begin to Eliza, into a land sown with mines. In other words, when he wanted to say to the person who was the love of his life at that moment something about the history they'd gone through together, he just instinctively, he didn't prepare this, instinctively reached into his pocket, put on a kippah, and misquoted the prophet. And I want to suggest to you in all seriousness, you need to know texts better to misquote them than to quote them. Anybody can say 4-7, but you really have to know what score is and be able to do the counting to quickly render a number in that kind of accounting, which is a different amount, 3 and whatever. 3 and 5, whatever the case may be. He lived inside this biblical narrative. When he spoke very often about Bris Latus, the city from which he came, which was of course destroyed during the war, he called it an Ir va'em b'Yisrael, which is a phrase that comes out of the Tanakh in the story of Sheva ben Bichri, when somebody says, "Why would you possibly destroy this city, which is a mother and a city in Israel?" Biblical allusions and biblical language come through at virtually every moment. He plotted himself and saw his life as being on this biblical tapestry. Now I want to say something a little bit more specific about how that played out. The Bible is, as every single one of us in this room knows, an extraordinary book with a majestic and grand view of history. It starts before time and then imagines the end of time. And it takes place over the course of many, many, many centuries. It is a book with almost infinite memory. And it's a book that can't imagine the Jewish people thinking of themselves without plotting themselves somewhere in that timeline, from before Breshit until after Acharit Yamim, which is described in several different locations, of course, in the Bible, in the Nevi'im, in the prophets. Begin had this grand view of history. The Irgun, or the Likud later on, or Gachal before the Likud, or Chairut before Gachal, these political parties, or his underground operation, this was all details. He never lost sight of it. It was all about the grand tapestry of restoring the Jewish people to its ancestral homeland, to the place where the Tanakh tells the story of the Jewish people being the sovereign masters of their own destiny. So when things between him and when him and Sadat were breaking down, Carter uses almost, unlimited pressure. And he says a line that I'm sure you can't imagine ever being said again. But Carter said, "This is the last chance for peace." Literally. Now, I know you're laughing because you can't imagine anyone else saying that. Begin was unmoved. And he didn't even bother to respond to Carter. Instead, he went on Israeli television. And he said, he didn't have very hard, he didn't have to pick which channel, there was only one. So he went on that channel, and he said, President Carter says that this is the last chance for peace. Let me now quote you exactly what he said. Our people lived thousands of years before Camp David, and will live thousands of years after Camp David. I.e., Camp David? You think this is a big deal? If you understand Tanakh, this is just a blip. There were blips before, there's going to be blips afterwards. If we are told that this is the last chance to arrive at peace, we will not agree. There are no last chances in life. And I think in a week like this, it's just almost impossible not to quote that and not to reflect on the kind of conviction, the kind of courage, the kind of certainty that came out of his plotting his own life on a much, much, much larger tapestry. You don't get to be the President of the United States of Washington, D.C. and tell me, who is in the process of restoring my thousands of year-old people to its ancestral homeland, my people that's been through several decades before what in Europe, you can't even begin to imagine. Don't talk to me about last chances. If there were last chances, there wouldn't be a state of Israel. If there wasn't constant Jewish renewal and rebirth, President Carter, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So there were simply no last chances. He had a sense of the grandeur and the majesty of Jewish history, never imagining for a moment that any of the specific issues, except when it came to saving Jewish lives, was of preeminent importance. But with that notion of this dramatic, grand tapestry of Jewish history, he also inherited other dimensions of what it meant to be a Jew. And he inherited, I think, as well, a deep and profound sense that what it meant to be a Jew was to be alone. He would quote all the time, Hein am levadad yishkon, there is a nation that dwells alone, the famous story of Balak, or Yeshno am echad lefazam ben ha'amim, says Haman to Ahasuerus, there is one people out there that is different from all the peoples, and so on and so forth. And for Begin, that differentness wasn't a problem to be overcome. For Begin, that differentness wasn't an awkward moment at Washington dinners when you couldn't eat the same thing as everybody else. For Begin, the differentness was the whole point. If you were going to be just like everybody else, what was the point of being? He inherited this biblical notion that we are here for a purpose. And you can't serve a purpose if you're exactly the same as everybody else. This notion of loneliness, this notion of aloneness, he would constantly refer to ships on the sea. And he meant, of course, the same ships. The St. Louis, 1939, comes to the shores of America, turned away, sent back to Europe. Historians estimate that approximately 25% of the people on the St. Louis who were within sight of America's shores actually died in concentration camps. Begin didn't even think that was that surprising. In 1940, many few people know about the Patriot. But the British were actually not only not letting Jews into Palestine, they were deporting Jews from Palestine. I mean, you understand what's going on? It's 1940. Where are these Jews supposed to go? The British are deporting Jews from Palestine. So they have the right papers. So they load all these Jews up, hundreds and hundreds of them, on this boat called the Patriot, which the Jewish underground decides to actually disable in the port of Haifa so that it couldn't take the Jews out, and they miscalculated, and the bomb was way too strong, and it blew up the ship, and lots of Jews were killed. But for Begin, also, this was part of the image. Balak can say, Hein am levadad yishkon, there is a nation that dwells utterly alone. And Begin never thought for a second that a single thing had changed. Begin knew full well the things of the sort that George McGovern spoke about on that very famous YouTube. You can find it, don't look for it now, but you'll find it later. Where McGovern, who was a bomber, he was the guy with the sights, I don't know what it's called, but the guy with the sights under the plane. And he spoke, it's on YouTube, you can find it, it's chilling. Talks about they would fly day in and day out over Germany on the way to ball bearings factories, because obviously ball bearings were critical to the German war effort. They were trying to bomb the factories day after day. And he said they saw Auschwitz, and they saw the tracks, and they saw the smoke, day after day after day, and they didn't bomb one track to one camp with one hit on one sortie, nothing. McGovern spoke about it as if he was later on in his life shocked. Begin wasn't shocked. It was a biblical notion. V'lamelech ein shovel lahanicham. There's no reason for you, Achashverosh, to let this people be. Its proverbial historical role is to be at the other end of history. Begin simply understood that. And that was what animated so very much of what he did. That was why he did Iraq. That was why he got into Lebanon. It's very easy to say in retrospect that Lebanon was a terrible mistake and Iraq was a great idea. But it could have worked out just the other way. Iraq could have been a disaster and he could have gotten in and out of Lebanon, especially if Sharon had not misled him. Could have worked out very differently. But what they had in common was this. Somebody was threatening the Jewish people. And the whole point of the Jewish state was no more. The whole point of the Jewish state was you can't do this anymore. And by the way, one of the things that distinguished Begin from almost every prime minister before and after, though it's not true, I mean, Ben-Gurion also, I think, followed this kind of way. You didn't have to wonder what he believed. You didn't have to wonder what he was committed to. I say the following, by the way, not in any way as criticism, but you actually don't know what Bibi's planning.
Oh, come on.
You don't actually know what he wants.
What year is this
You just
lecture?
don't know. And maybe that's smart, but you don't know. With Bacon, you knew absolutely. You knew he wanted a deal with Egypt.
This is from 11 years ago, damn.
To get it, except we told it there was a last chance, because that did not cohere with his biblical worldview. But he had this notion of the Jews being alone, the St. Louis, the Patria, the Shruma, many of you know, 42, sets sail, if I'm not mistaken, from Romania, if I'm not mistaken, 900 Jews on board, one toilet. 900 Jews, supposed to be a few days. The thing breaks down right outside.
And by the way, here's my comment. The reason that you know what Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin believed in was that they were believers first, politicians second. Bibi is a politician. So that's just a normal way how politics works.
The Turkish won't let the Jews off the boat. The British let the Turks know, we're not taking them. Nobody knows what to do with these Jews. They are actually fed and given water by wealthy Jews from Istanbul while they languish there for several months on the boat. When finally the Turks have had enough, they tow the boat back up into the Black Sea. The engine is still not working, and leave it there. Unless, by the way, you are tempted to say that nations change over the course of time. The Soviets did not want this boat drifting towards their shore. So with now 800 something, because a few sick people had been taken off in Istanbul, they sent a submarine that fired one torpedo at the boat and sank it. And one person survived. He lives in Bend, Oregon. This was the world in which Bacon was doing his work. And so when people critique him for the years in the underground, and there were some pretty horrific events that took place during those years of the underground, much more on the part of the Lehi, because the Irgun took pains to try at all costs to avoid civilian casualties. But it was still an underground movement. Lots of people were killed in the King David Hotel. Lots of British soldiers were killed in all sorts of different kinds of attacks. One needs to understand that he understood this in biblical dimensions. This was simply the book of Joshua all over again. This was a people with no place to go, needs to get home. If anything, it was worse in the 1940s than it had been in the time of the book of Joshua. There was no place for these people to go. And if you understood the Tanakh the way you understood the Tanakh, then you were simply a player. You were simply a soldier in that army of restoring the Jewish people to its early grandeur. So throughout his life, I think you can understand him infinitely better if you understand him as working on the background of a grand biblical tapestry. There is another way in which Bible has an enormous impact on him. He was not a terribly theological guy. He actually wrote quite a bit. He didn't write any theology. And he had a grand book planned for the end of his life. He had a grand book planned for the end of his life, but it wasn't going to be theological. And in fact, when the pilots landed back in the Sinai after the attack on Osirak, everyone wanted to know, is this Tzahal? Is this God? And what did Begin say? Todah la'el sheyesh lanu tayasim ka'el. Right? Thank God we have pilots like this. Which is to say, he kind of dodged it. Thank God for the pilots. He wasn't a terribly theological guy in every respect, but about certain theological certainties, he had no doubt. And one of them was that God had given the land of Israel to the Jewish people. He just knew it. He just knew it. As certain as you know that this is a podium, he knew that God had given the land of Israel to the Jewish people. And that animated him. He could actually stare down power. I'll give you an example when this comes out. Carter is pressing him on dividing Jerusalem. Camp David was not a high point for Begin. In fact, he didn't want to go in the first place. I'd never been, many of you probably have, but I'm told it's very pretty. But in any event, he gets off at Camp David with his whole entourage, and they're like, wow, look at this, pretty nice, huh? And he looks around and he says to them, Auschwitz Deluxe. Which was his way of saying, once again, a Jew is in a camp where he doesn't really want to be, and not good things are going to happen here. Now, the real negotiation was between Begin and Sadat about Egypt, and everybody pretty much knew what the deal was going to be. Sinai was going to go back. Begin didn't want it to go back, but he kind of understood. Carter was making a big deal about the Palestinians. I know you find it very hard to imagine a president of the United States taking such a position, but Carter was making a very big deal about the Palestinians. Don't forget, it's very important not to be historically inaccurate or anachronistic here. Nobody was talking about a Palestinian state. Nobody was talking about autonomy. Nobody knew what they were talking about. They just thought the Palestinian issue had to be resolved somehow. The only person that really thought it was going to get resolved at Camp David was Jimmy Carter. Begin knew it wasn't going to get resolved because he wasn't giving up Yehuda v'Shomron to the Palestinians because God had given it to him. Sadat knew it wasn't going back because he didn't care. He was just saying that he cared about the Palestinians to pass a certain amount of muster. The only person that didn't kind of get with the program was Jimmy Carter with that pressing. At a certain point, Carter actually pressed Begin about Jerusalem, saying, Sadat tells me you have to split Jerusalem with the Palestinians. At which, and here's again, Israel's Jewish prime minister. Begin said, President Carter, let me tell you a story. Every year of my life, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I open up the Machzor. And I said, and we read Unatana Tokef, who by fire, who by water, who and so on and so forth, which was written by Rabbi Amnon of Mainz, which is what all the Machzorim say. It's also not true, but that doesn't matter for our purposes tonight. And the tradition has it that Rabbi Amnon of Mainz wrote this after he was told to convert to Christianity, and he asked for 3 days to think about it. Then he came back and said, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. Of course, I'm not converting to Christianity. And then he was tortured. His legs were cut off, his arms were cut off, and so on and so forth. As he was dying, he recited Unatana Tokef. Okay. Says Begin to Carter, I am not going to make the mistake that Rabbi Amnon of Mainz made. I don't need 3 days. The answer is no. The answer is never. There are certain things in my people that will never happen. And Carter, who did understand religious conviction, scurried out of the room, told Sadat, he told me some story about a rabbi, had his arms cut off, his legs cut off. I don't exactly understand the details. He's not splitting Jerusalem. And the point of that is, of course, that when you speak with conviction, people hear you. When things are not negotiable, people hear that things are not negotiable. So there were certain things, like Yerushalayim, the city of David, the city that David had founded, and so on and so forth, about which Begin was absolutely positively certain. He was also certain, by the way, that there were wrongs, just like Amalek, that can never be righted. Once Amalek, always Amalek. Now I know Moshe Halbertal wrote the very important paper showing that it's not so simple and that there's a much more complicated tradition. But at least on the face of it, biblically, Amalek is evil incarnate. And there's nothing that you can do except remember to destroy Amalek wherever you find them forever and forever, says Deuteronomy 25. For Begin, it was very clear what the modern Amalek was. So in the early years of the state, when Ben-Gurion begins to talk about the possibility, in 1952 approximately, of getting German reparations, and by the way, the German word for reparations is chilling.
Oh my God.
Wieder gut machen. So for those of you that know how to parse German words, wieder again, gut, good, machen to make things good again. That's what the Germans called it. And Bacon had actually dropped out of politics and was called back into politics by his comrades, who understood, by the way, they were very smart. This was going to be the moment where he was going to take the role of reminding Israel what its Jewish conscience would look like. Yes, Ben-Gurion was right that Israel desperately needed the money. There are times that the Israel Museum actually has an exhibit which occasionally comes back where they show you the ration cards for salt, for flour, for sugar. Forget meat. Sardines in the early 1950s. It was all ration. There was no food. More food gets thrown out on a Friday night at the King David Hotel every Shabbos right now than Jerusalem had to share.
Yeah.
There was no food. So Ben-Gurion wasn't wrong that they desperately needed the money. And it's very possible, by the way, that had the German reparations not been paid, that Israel would not have made it. But for Begin, what's the cost for letting Amalek go for him? How much money does Amalek have to pay you for Deuteronomy 25 no longer to be valid? How many shekels, how many machzita shekels does Amalek have to give to the building of the tabernacle, Lahavdil, right? For them to say, okay, we're no longer the terrible, it was an impossible question. And Bacon actually asked Ben-Gurion in the Knesset, how much money are you getting for every single dead Jew? And how much money are you getting for my mother, and my father, and my brother, whose name was Herzl, interestingly enough. Begin, by the way, was thrown out of the Knesset. He was actually told to leave the plenum. He had to be re-sworn in after they made a little bit of shalom. But again, this was biblical right and wrong. This was non-negotiable. God's gift of the Jewish, to the Jewish people of the land of Israel was completely non-negotiable. More on which in a little bit. As was a biblical notion of right and wrong. When there's Amalek, there's Amalek. You never need money badly enough to forgive Amalek. And if you think that he didn't mention Amalek 1,000 times in the Knesset, then just go back and read the protocols. It's all very, very biblical. Time is getting late. I want to try to just breeze through a few other things and then make one point about where all this biblical certainty would leave him today. I've said it a few times, but I think it ought to be stated explicitly. The Bible is not the story of the Jews. The Bible is the story of the Jewish people, who happen to have a religion, happen to have a land, happen to have a history, happen to have a language, happen to have a whole bunch of laws, but it's fundamentally the story of a people. Begin got them. That's why he was elected. Because there was something peoplehood about him that he could never even be perceived as partaking of the disdain that the Mapai had for the immigrants from North Africa. The immigrants from North Africa understood the great irony that the guy who most cared about them was the Polish Jew in the suit. They didn't own a suit. Ben-Gurion tried to dress just like them. Those silly little overall onesie things.
He didn't try, that was just him.
But in any event, and Ben-Gurion used to go to the Ma'abarot wearing this little zip-up astronaut suit. And he thought he was being just like the people in the Ma'abarot. And the people in the Ma'abarot looked and said, the Prime Minister can't dress up for us. And Begin only owned a suit. One. That's what he owned. So that's what he wore. By the way, all the years that he was in the opposition, 29 years, on one Rosenbaum in Tel Aviv, he and his wife and 3 children lived in a one-bedroom apartment. The 3 children, even as teenagers, 2 girls and a boy in one room, and then he and Elisa would take the L-shaped sofa, push it together, and that was a bed. I mean, we have come a very long way to quote the Virginia Slims ad, but it's just not clear in what direction. I mean, in some ways terrifically, but in certain ways there was just... Golda Meir also, by the way, after she was Prime Minister, lived in an unbelievably simple apartment. And there was that to be said for that early generation. It's true that there was not enough food, but there was also a certain sense of value.
Yeah,
But
right.
he had this very real sense that he wasn't any better than those Sephardic Jews. The fact that they were from Yemen or North Africa, wherever they were from, and that he was from Poland and had the advantage of higher education, didn't make him any better than that, and they understood that. The great irony, of course, is that it's North African Jews who voted the Polish gentleman into office in Israel. And it was a direct result of his clear conception of peoplehood. When he got the Nobel Prize, he and Sadat, by the way, got it together. Sadat didn't want to come. He was afraid that he was going to be assassinated. So what did he do? He sent his son-in-law. I think that's just a great move. You know, sweetie, if you could just take a trip for me, I would be so grateful. And of course, tragically, it didn't save Sadat. He was killed a few years later in Cairo, actually. But he didn't go. Begin did go. And in Begin's speech, he says, with no false humility, he said, the prize does not belong to me. It belongs to my people. And he gave a history lesson of 2,000 years of Jewish history, of which the state of Israel was the crowning achievement and most recent point, but it was not the major point. He was simply part of a large biblical arc. By the way, he didn't even take the money. The money actually still generates prizes for education that are given out to this very day. And when he left office, he had no place to live. He didn't own anything. He didn't own an apartment. He had no money to pay rent. His friends and many of his Canadian supporters got together, scrounged him some money, and bought him a little apartment in Jerusalem. The guy won $1 million for the Nobel Prize. So, but he had this notion that it wasn't his. He was simply an emissary of his people. And I think that the Israelis really understood that. And when you get into a camp today in Israel, no matter what's going on, it can be Ovadia Yosef is dying, it could be President Obama's not doing exactly what Israel likes, it could be the Syrian, it could be the end of Bitcoin, I mean, it could be whatever it is, and the taxi driver will say to you, you know what we need? We need Begin. And you'd say to him, what would Begin do about the Syrian civil war? What would Begin do about this, about that? It's not about, you need Begin because, says this taxi driver, we're all in it together. It's when it came to Begin. Don't forget the Beitar anthem. Ivri gan ben oni ben sar. Every Hebrew, no matter how poor, is a prince. And the whole notion of hadar in the Beitar anthem. That Jewish life was fundamentally about pride. The Jews were going to go back to the land in which they had once been sovereign and restore the pride in themselves and who they were that they had once known. One other point that I want to make before wrapping up, which is, of course, that in the Bible, universalism and particularism exist quite comfortably together.
Yeah.
The world that we know, with rabid universalists on the one side who are embarrassed by Jewish particularism, and Jewish particularists on the other side, who really couldn't care less about people who are not Jews, or not religious, or not Zionists, or whatever, Begin didn't understand that. Because the Bible didn't understand that. The Bible's not exactly a book abashed about Jewish particularism. Right? All the nations of the world will be blessed because you're here. That's not exactly being embarrassed about particularism. But in the many prophetic visions of the world to come, people don't all become Jewish. The various peoples of the world all worship God and come to Jerusalem, and they all get along just fine. Begin was one of those people who refused to distinguish between Jews and non-Jews when it came to critical issues like saving lives, for example. The first act, as many of you know, before we'd actually taken office, but we had already been elected, was to accept as citizens these Vietnamese boat people who were languishing on the South China Sea. 5 ships had passed them, and not one had stopped. They've been without food and water for days. The women and children were given an allotment of 2 teaspoons of water a day. The men got nothing. And not a ship stopped. An Israeli freighter saw them, scooped them up, radioed back, what do we do? And Begin said, bring them home, we'll make them citizens. And it was just because that's what the Tanakh would say that you should do. Lo toneh et hager ki ger hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. You can't turn your eyes away from a stranger because you know what it is to be a stranger when nobody cares about you.
Oh my God.
And one could go on and on and on and on. This notion, by the way, it was Begin, of all people, who pushed for the end of military rule over Israeli Arabs. So what are you talking about? They're citizens. You don't have military rule for some of your citizens and civil rule for other citizens. They're citizens. And it was Begin's push that actually ended military rule. So I think you can see the whole comfortable coexistence between universalism and particularism also as an outgrowth of his deep biblical sensibilities. But I think it's also true and also very sad that his biblical sensibilities also led to his end. He and Elisa had, it was just a love affair. It was just one of those old-fashioned things. Boy meets girl, boy loves girl, and boy stays in love with girl till the very, very end. It was shir hashirim. It was really this sense of pathos that you hear in certain biblical love allusions. And as she got older and older and sicker, he knew that her days were numbered. And he told, actually, the American ambassador that he was going to probably have to resign because he wanted to spend her last days devoted to her. And he was supposed to go speak at the General Assembly in LA. And she was already in the hospital. She had very bad asthma. That's by the way, she had asthma already in Russia. She was intubated and on oxygen. Nobody thought she was dying, but she was sick. And he told her, I'm not going to go to LA. And she wrote him a note and said, you have to go, it's important, I'll be fine. Go, come back. He flew to LA, and on Shabbos morning, Benny called Kadishai to tell Begin that she had died. And he moaned on the plane immediately. Of course, they packed up and flew home. And he moaned the entire time, Lama azavti ota, Lama azavti ota. Why did I leave her? Why did I leave her? This end of this love story actually began the beginning of his real death. He had inherited something else from the Bible, which was an enormous admiration for Jewish warriors. He saw in Yitzhak Rabin, in Moshe Dayan, in Ariel Sharon, the revival of the tradition of the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. He couldn't help himself. It was just clear that these guys were simply part of Jewish history being reborn. One of the most moving moments, I have to say, of working on the book was being in the National Archives of Israel and being shown a sheet of paper which says Sodi Bioter, top secret. That's pretty cool. Not so Sodi anymore. Of course, he's using his iPhone to take pictures of it. But in any event, it says Sodi Bioter, and it's the protocol of the cabinet meeting, I think on the second or third day of the war in 67. And Menachem Begin, who's now part of the cabinet for the first time, even though he's not been elected because it's a national unity government, so he's a minister without portfolio, has a ridiculous idea, which only a person who thought in the book of Joshua terms could possibly have. Remember the city of Jericho used to be home of one of the world's great casinos. But in any event, Begin says, when they're talking about whether they should go out and capture Jerusalem, for him that's like, duh, right? I mean, what are we here for? So that was not even a question. And then he said, when we capture Jerusalem, here's what I want. When we capture Jerusalem, Mr. Prime Minister, I would like to suggest that the chief rabbi be summoned and brought to the kotel, and that he blow the shofar. Now everybody's seen the picture of Rabbi Goren blowing the shofar. But nobody knows that it was Begin's idea. Everybody thinks, well, of course, every 2,000 years when the Jews recapture the kotel, the chief rabbi comes and blows the shofar. That's how you always do it. Well, that's not how you always do it, because we've never, ever done it again before. And Begin was the one who thought in biblical terms. This is like Jericho. You blow the shofar. And again, you and I take it for granted because that photograph of Goren is so ubiquitous. But it was actually Begin's idea. So he had this love of generals. He had a sense that contemporary Israeli battles were really the continuation of the ancient conquest of the land. And therefore, he really didn't believe that a great general could deceive him. But Ariel Sharon did deceive him. Ariel Sharon lied. And Ariel Sharon crossed the 40-kilometer border either without telling him or without making it clear. It's very conflicted, the story. There was one point when I was working on the book that one day I was in Yechiel Kadishai's apartment in Tel Aviv. Said, did Sharon misrepresent things to Begin? Absolutely not. Begin knew exactly what was going on. He wanted to attack Syria too, a little bit much, but nonetheless, Kadishai said Begin was completely on top of things because the last thing that Kadishai wanted was the image of Begin as an old man who wasn't entirely in charge. The very next day, I was in Aryeh Naor's apartment in Jerusalem, who was Secretary of the Cabinet back then, and I said to him, did Ariel Sharon deceive Begin? And he said, of course. It's Ariel Sharon. I mean, what are you talking about? I actually think that Naor got this one right and Kadishai got this one wrong. Begin never really got it. Never really got it. Until it was far too late. And then came Sabra and Shakila, and he remarked to Avner, going into the car at one point after Sabra and Shakila, get a load of this. Say it in Yiddish. Goyim kill Goyim, and the world blames the Jews. In a certain way, that was true, but obviously Israelis understood that it was much more complicated. And he was forced to testify. He was forced to appoint and then testify before the Hakan Commission. And a broken man, without Eliza, with Lebanon casualties going way up, sits in front of this folding table with lots of microphones. He's the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. And they ask him for his name. And he says, Menachem Ben Ze'ev V'Chassid. Begin. In other words, Menachem, son of Ze'ev V'Chassid, Begin. Which was to say, at the end of the day, he referred to himself not as Prime Minister Begin, not as Menachem Begin. He referred to himself to the Jews for thousands of years have referred to themselves. So-and-so, then so-and-so, all throughout the time. And that's where he ended, quietly, still as a Jew, buried, of all places, not on Har Herzl, but on the Mount of Olives. The mountain of which the prophets had spoken, the mountain from which the prophets had spoken, where he could be buried next to Feinstein and Barazani, who in British prison about to be executed, hugged the grenade between them, sang Adon Olam, pulled the pin, and robbed the British of the opportunity to kill them because they took their own lives. And with the following brief anecdote from Kadishai, the very last time that I saw him. I said to him, this was just less than a year ago, what would he do today? Kadishai was very sharp, to the very end. Kadishai's wife, Bambi, was making him a cup of tea a few months ago, and she turned around, but he was sharp to the very end. In fact, when I asked him why he'd never written his memoirs, because he had a fascinating life. He'd been sent to Rome to bomb the British headquarters there at Begin's request, needed a ride back to Palestine, so he hopped a ride on a boat called the Altalena. I mean, he had an amazing life, this Kadishai. And I said, how'd you ever publish your memoirs? He said, Shmani, I'm only 90, I've got time. Thankfully, by the way, they were just published last month. He actually approved it before he died. But he was an extraordinarily interesting guy. And he was a starker. When he would mention a Jabotinsky poem that I didn't know by heart, first I would just look at me with utter disgust. I mean, you call yourself semi-educated. You don't know the poem about whatever. We would run to the other room, we'd bring back home, read. So now I was trying to interview him that I'm doing, reading and making sure I get it right. So he was sharp to the very end. And I said to him, what will you do today? And he said, I'll never forget. He said, to tell you the truth, I have no idea. Because the world's gotten to be a very complicated place. But here's what I think we can. I think we can know that whatever he would have done with the world being an infinitely more complicated place, he would have done with a sense of biblical context. He would have done with a sense that the renewal of the State of Israel is not just a fascinating national phenomenon. The renewal of the State of Israel is not an opportunity for a high-tech bunch of startups. The renewal of the State of Israel is simply the continuation of the biblical story. He felt that with every fiber of his being. It was because of that he fought reparations. It was because of that he destroyed Iraq. It was because of that he did so many of the things that he did. And I would suggest to you that regardless of where any Jew on the planet is on the political or ideological spectrum, in having been taught by Menachem Begin to think about Israel in terms of its biblical context, its biblical roots, and its biblical purpose. To think of it far beyond a mere national project, but as a project of Jewish national biblical renewal. I would suggest to you that we are all, regardless of our political or ideological stripes, deeply in his debt. Yehi Zichro Baruch. May his memory be blessed.
Nice.
Vous souhaitez vous former à l'anglais pour votre vie personnelle ou votre quotidien professionnel? Créez votre propre formation d'anglais.
You've spoke to me a little bit of Russian. Where does that come from? So your appreciation of Tolstoy, but also your ability to speak a bit of Russian. Where's that from?
So I speak, in addition to English, I speak reasonably well, depending on how much vodka I've had.
Yes.
Russian, I speak French and German. I learned those for research purposes. I learned French actually when I was in high school, Russian when I was in college, German when I was in graduate school. Now I do have family on my mother's side that's of Russian Jewish extraction, but they were Yiddish speakers by the time I met them. By the time they had gone through Germany and come to the United States, or really gone through Poland and come to the United States, they were Yiddish speakers. So there's no one really in my family who speaks Russian, but I do feel a connection there, at least a long range personal connection.
Is there something to be said about the language and your ability to imagine history? Sort of when you study these different countries, your ability to imagine what it was like to be a part of that culture, part of that time.
Yes, language is crucial to understanding a culture, and even if you learn the languages I have, you learning Russian and German and French, it's still not the same as also being a native speaker either, as you know. But I think language tells you a lot about mannerism, about assumptions. The very fact that English doesn't have a formal U, but Russian has a formal U, right? V versus T, right? German has a formal U, Z versus D, right? So the fact that English doesn't have a formal U tells you something about Americans, right? That's just one example. The fact that that Germans have such a wider vocabulary for certain scientific concepts than we have in English tells you something about the culture, right? Language is an artifact of the culture. The culture makes the language.
It's fascinating to explore. I mean, even just exactly what you just said, which is there's a fascinating transition. So I guess in English we just have you. There's a fascinating transition that persists to this day, is of formalism and politeness, where it's an initial kind of dance of interaction that's with different methods of signaling respect. I guess we don't. The language provides that, and in the English language, there's fewer tools to show that kind of respect, which has potentially positive or negative effects on. It flattens the society where, like, a teenager could talk to an older person and show like a deference. But at the same time, it creates a certain kind of dynamic, a certain kind of society, and it's funny to think of just like those few words can have a ripple effect through the whole culture.
And we don't have a history in the United States of aristocracy.
Yeah.
These elements of language reflect aristocracy. The serf would never refer to the master, even if the master is younger, as Toy. It's always Toy, right? And Turgenev, it's always Toy, right? I mean, and so it's so it tells you something about the history. That's why, to your question, which was a great question, it's so crucial to try to penetrate the language. I'll also say something else, and this is a problem for many Americans who haven't learned a foreign language. We're very bad at teaching foreign languages. If you've never taught yourself a foreign language, you have closed yourself off to certain kinds of empathy, because you have basically trained your brain to only look at the world one way. The very act of learning another language, I think, tells your brain that words and concepts don't translate one-to-one. This is the first thing you realize, right? We can say, these two words mean the same thing from two languages. They never mean exactly
Yes.
The same thing. Right? Dos vidania is really not goodbye,
Yes.
right?
And there's something, right now there's people talking about idea of lived experience. One of the ways to force yourself into this idea of lived experience is by learning another language.
Right.
Is to understand that you can perceive the world in a totally different way, even though you're perceiving the same thing. And of course, the way to first learn Russian for those looking for tutorial lessons for me is just like as you said, you start by drinking lots of vodka.
Yes, of course.
It's very difficult to do otherwise.
That was fun.